hello to each and every one of you out there in your homes. I'm so very grateful that you've come here to mine, and in fact, right here to my library where I keep all my books, so we can do some story time with Mr. Michael. Today we're going to get to read a very, very cool book, and I'm super excited to find out what's inside. I've never read this book before. This is going to be my very first time, and we get to share it together. Now, a lot of you know that I like animals. I like all sorts of animals. But today we're going to read about an animal we've never read about before, because we're going to be reading Mr. Bumble by Kim Kennedy, illustrated by Doug Kennedy. This book sure looks cool. Mr. Bumble looks like a bee to me. I don't think he's just wearing a bee costume. He's got his little pot of honey and everything. So why don't we find out what's inside Mr. Bumble? Mr. Bumble by Kim Kennedy, illustrated by Doug Kennedy. Every spring, the meadows became a buzzing and busy scene, with hundreds of bumblebees gathering pollen for their hive. Such work came easily to all the bees. To all the bees, that is, but one. His name was Mr. Bumble, and he was the clumsiest bee who ever buzzed. Sadly, when it came to gathering pollen, he could never take off from a flower without bumbling, fumbling, and tumbling. While the other bees buzzed back to their queen with mounds of the golden dust, Mr. Bumble always returned with the smallest share. "Another empty bucket," Queen Bee would fuss. "Dense are all you seem to gather." One evening, the queen held court. "Something grand has happened," she announced. "Today, one of our scouts buzzed over an undiscovered clover patch. There you will find a gold mine of pollen." Everyone was excited about the news, except Mr. Bumble. He couldn't help wondering what might lurk in that patch, just waiting to catch a clumsy bee. "Study this map well," declared the queen, "for tomorrow you will journey there." "But what else did the scout see?" Mr. Bumble asked. "Does something live in that patch? And if so, what if it's mean?" "Well," said the queen, "if that's true, those of you who are quick and clever have nothing to fear. But those who are not," she added, looking at Mr. Bumble, "beware." To Mr. Bumble, things looked grim indeed, for even if he made it to the patch, he could only guess what terrible things awaited him there. That night, he dreamed of monsters doing dreadful deeds, like plucking out his very wings. Though the next morning's journey was long and hard, Mr. Bumble finally managed to arrive, but only to find that the other bees had already filled up their buckets and flown away. Teetering atop a blossom, Mr. Bumble began his lonely work. Plink went the pollen into his basket. Clink went some more. But just as he was going plinkety-clink to the next flower, a frightful noise arose that sent a shiver round his stripes and curled his little toes. Mr. Bumble had to get out of there and get out of there quick. But he tripped and stumbled and landed with a horrible crash. "Oh no!" he yelped in a helpless heap. "I'm done for!" He cried in fear, for not only was he seeing stars, but the bucket was stuck on his head. Suddenly, he was hoisted high in the air. "Please let me go," Mr. Bumble squeaked. Yet higher still he went. "Don't pluck out my wings," he begged. "Why ever would we do that?" came a tiny voice as he was set gently upon the ground. Then the bucket was lifted away, revealing a splendid sight. "Fairies!" He buzzed with relief. Looking about, he realized how wrong he had been. Indeed, there wasn't one monster in the entire clover patch. As for the lift the fairies gave him, it was the best flight he'd ever had. "If I could fly like a fairy," he sighed, "I could gather pollen as well as the other bees." "We can teach you," the fairies chimed. "We'll show you how it's done." Mr. Bumble's first lesson was in taking off, so they launched him from a tiny blue bonnet. Beneath him, they stretched a spider web net to catch him if he fell. With a boing and a buzz, he sailed into the air, flying higher and straighter with each and every try. And when Mr. Bumble took off without trouble, the fairies knew it was time for his next lesson, how to land gently upon a flower. They guided Mr. Bumble by daisy chains so he wouldn't belly flop. He learned how to step upon flowers without disturbing a single raindrop. For the first time, he buzzed without bumbling, flew without fumbling, and twirled without tumbling. "I can finally fly with grace," he cried. This called for a celebration, so the fairies held a flying party for Mr. Bumble, where he could give all their tricks a whirl. And never before had the sky been filled with such fancy feats of flight. Soon, it was time for Mr. Bumble to go, so he filled his bucket with pollen. "Thank you, my friends," he buzzed as they all waved goodbye, and with his bucket held high, off he flew to his hive. Meanwhile, the Queen was searching the evening sky. "That clumsy Mr. Bumble must be lost again," she sighed. Just then she spotted a bee zipping through the air. "Surely that can't be Mr. Bumble buzzing there." But who was it but Mr. Bumble, who guided all the way her down to her throne? "For her Royal Highness," he said, and with a buzz and a bow he presented his astonished queen with a bucket of golden dust. "Hooray!" cheered his fellow bees. Why, the Queen cheered for him too. "What a fine bee you turned out to be," she said. "You deserve something better to carry." With that, she presented Mr. Bumble with a bucket made of gold. As for Mr. Bumble's old bucket, it was placed for future bees to see. "Though old and worn," said the queen bee, "it is still an inspiring sight. Look on it as the humble beginning to every perfect flight." The end. Goodness sakes, everybody. Well, Mr. Bumble sure found out that if you find the right friends and you practice really, really hard at something you really want to be good at, you can be really, really good at something. That's a pretty good lesson for everything, whether it's reading you want to be really good at, or playing music, or doing math, or running, or playing baseball, or playing soccer, or skydiving, or swimming. Anything you want to do, if you practice at it and you find out the right ways to do it, you can be really great at something someday. That's sure what I try and do. There's tons of stuff I want to be good at, and so I practice all the time. I practice reading, I practice writing, I practice playing music, I practice doing story times with Mr. Michael, I practice reading everybody's favorite books. And if you happen to think about that comment section below and write down what your favorite book is, maybe I'll get a chance to read it next time on Storytime with Mr. Michael. Thanks everybody for coming by today. I hope you are having a wonderful day. I hope this made it a little bit better. I know it made mine better. So keep reading, everybody. Stay curious, and I'll see you next time. Bye.